Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 1 of day 5 of the Swim Ontario virtual AGM and conference. We've got a great session for you today. Lots of information to share. Information dense, I think, is a good way to put it to you. My name is Stu McLean. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Provincial and Regional Programs Coordinator for Swim Ontario. And I'm pleased to welcome our speaker this morning, presenter, if you will. Aaron Maszko is a data analysis manager of high performance pathways for Swimming Canada. Aaron is a graduate of the University of Western Ontario, specializing in physics and applied math. He also holds both a master's in biomedical engineering and a bachelor's of education. Aaron is a native of Ontario, growing up in Peterborough, where he started swimming with the Trent Swim Club, and he has been actively involved in the sport of swimming since then. Some of you may remember Aaron from his time as the head coach of the Halifax Trojans and as the provincial coach for Swim Saskatchewan. So with regards to questions, there will be opportunity throughout the course of the presentation to ask questions. So please put them in the chat, and then I'll pose them to Aaron. And then we'll do some questions at the end. And Aaron will give you a breakdown of how the presentation will roll out today. I've seen this presentation now a few times, and every time I manage to pick something else out that sort of sparks my thinking. So I look forward to seeing it again. I look forward to all of you seeing it, and I welcome Aaron to the Swim Ontario conference.
Great, thank you. You can hear me okay, Stu?
Sure can.
Excellent, great. All right, well, thank you everybody for the opportunity to work with you today. As Stu mentioned, we will have a fairly information-dense session today. I encourage questions along the way. We will take a break. This is a two-part presentation, one part focusing on registration numbers, and the second portion will be talking about performance numbers from across Canada inside of Swim Ontario. And between those two sessions, we'll take a bit of a break. 1 or 2 minutes, you can go grab a coffee. If you think of a question and you want to go back and revisit it, then type in the chat and Stu will let us all know that it's there, and we'll try to answer it there. As Stu mentioned, I think this is the third different type of presentation we've given with this type of information. Once was to each of the provincial sections one-on-one, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Then there was a presentation where we went over this in a very quick high level for the select coaches group. And now we're going into a deeper dive with this information, more specifically targeting Swim Ontario. So what this is a high level, a quick dive into some of the interesting findings related to club performance and club registration, or provincial performance and provincial registration. This is part of a much larger body of work that Swimming Canada has been working on at the request of the provincial sections to help them understand how their province is doing in terms of registration or in terms of their performance. And so we investigated many, many areas, found a couple of really interesting nuggets, or at least things that we found very interesting, and that's what we're going to be presenting here today. I just want to start by saying I think the title of the conference is really fitting, particularly when we start discussing some of the things that we're talking around registration and performance today. In the last 2 years, everybody's had to approach things differently, and so rarely do we have an opportunity for a full reset and the opportunity to not do things the way we've always done them because that's the way we always did them. I think some of the problems or challenges, that we see them happening year over year. And now we have this opportunity to potentially act differently and tackle some of these problems because we have this opportunity of massive change. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about today? We're talking about registration and retainment, as well as peak performance and peak-to-peak performance. At the onset of the pandemic, Swimming Canada took a deep dive into our registration tracking and results system, the RTR, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. the reports that we generated for each of the provinces were very, very detailed. They looked at how many athletes actually raced in both windows, being the March and April window to July, August window. Perhaps they only swam in one of those windows. Some didn't swim at all inside of those windows, and what was happening there. We were interested in the performance rates of improvement for men and women in both the Olympic and Paralympic programs, as well as how many athletes were getting on track, achieving the FINA standards, all those standard sort of measures that Swimming Canada has been doing for years. We looked at average club improvement by both gender and by age. We looked at depth of performance in each of our Olympic and Paralympic events, looking at how many athletes were able to achieve, say on the Paralympic side, how many points in their specific categories. On the Olympic side, how many were within 2% of the on-track times, 1%, etc. So we could provide a really detailed picture of how each province is doing, as well as a comparison to the national averages or the national numbers. So province could see, we're ahead here and we're maybe a little bit behind here, and this is a challenge for us. In terms of registration, we looked at the number of new swimmers coming into the program, the number of returning swimmers, how many were transitioning from, say, what's in our RTR currently as non-competitive, but we consider pre-competitive to competitive. We know who moved to what province and when they did that. So really, really detailed look. We tracked every single athlete in Canada over from season to season, and tried to understand what was happening with them. These reports were fairly dense, as Stu alluded to here, and that was the first document that Stu received from us. The provincial performance document that we provided was about 100 pages, and even though we were only going over it at a high level so that the provincial sections could take the document away and really understand what they were reading, it took about 3 hours to go through slide by slide, looking at each page and trying to explain sort of what we're trying to capture in this information. The registration document was a little bit shorter. It was about 25 pages. It still took us about 90 minutes to go through and ask questions and have a better understanding. And this feedback process was really, really important for Swimming Canada. We are trying our best to provide really meaningful information to the provinces, information that a province or club could take away and act upon. But if there are things additionally that we missed or we glanced over, they were really, really good at providing that feedback back to the national body. So we really appreciate that. And it's a great working relationship that we have. Okay. So the first section we're going to be talking about is registration and attainment. Stu will be monitoring the chat. I'm happy to jump on questions on the fly, but as I said earlier, we've got a bit of a delay in our broadcast, as you know. So we'll try to do that as we can. If you think of something after we've gone through a lot of these registration or attainment slides, then please bring it in the chat and we'll take a little break about halfway through the presentation and talk about those questions then, and we can flip back through the slides until we get to the spot that we were interested in. Okay, so registration or attainment, we're looking at tracking RTR registered athletes in the competitive or non-competitive categories. Now, again, we consider these, and we'll be talking about pre-competitive. The non-competitive category in Swimming Canada's RTR is what we would consider to be pre-competitive athletes that are trying swimming and then thinking about getting into competitive swimming. We did not track those athletes that only registered as varsity or only registered as masters. This is a direction we're interested in pursuing in the future. But as our first attempt at providing some really meaningful information, we just focused on the two categories. If an athlete who had been attending a university and had been racing in a varsity program came back and raced for the rest of the season with a club, that club needed to have changed their registration status from varsity to competitive. So those athletes would have been captured in our system. However, if a varsity swimmer did not register in the competitive category, meaning they did not plan on competing past March, then we didn't track those athletes. If an athlete was a high school student in a previous year and then went to varsity and pursued that route, then that athlete in our system or in our statistics would have appeared to have quit at that age because we no longer track that athlete. In a sense, they did quit year-round competitive swimming if they transferred to varsity and did not swim for more than 6-7 months of the year. So that was our take on it. We will be looking at in the future tracking those athletes that do compete in varsity over a number of months and then only stay varsity. Maybe they go back and train, but they're no longer competing through the summers. These are things that we do plan on looking at in the future. To understand athlete age, we needed to pick something, as we're always comparing in terms of our registration system, athletes that either have joined us for the first time in September's registration, or they've quit during some time in the previous season. So a lot of our information we'll be looking at today would be looking, say, at the 2017-18 season, and then seeing what happened in the 2018-19 season. How do we compare ages there? We made a decision that we're interested in the year of birth as of the first year of a competitive season, so that we could track more or less comparable numbers, apples to apples, of athletes that quit at 13 and then maybe joined at 13, and have a really good understanding of those years. So in the 2017-18 season, we would say that the athlete's age was as of the 2018 season, and they would be consistent with the ages of the athletes that were registering or re-registering in the 2018-19 season. So we're using 2018 for both of those to track the ages. We don't have any ability to go much more granular than that to understand how many days an athlete was swimming, perhaps. This is because it would be dependent upon all registrars across Canada, or all club members who was ever doing that registrar type job, to enter the date that that athlete withdrawn from the program. We don't have that information in the RTR, and even if we did allow it, I'm not sure how many clubs have the time to track every single athlete that is leaving and on what day they left. So this is something that we hope to improve in the future in terms of our granularity of understanding this data. So why look at this? We're interested in understanding the registration retainment system that may help clubs allocate resources to particular areas. So areas that might pose a challenge, areas where we know there is a high flux of new athletes coming in and a lot of athletes going out. What's great is that since we did all of this information, or we gathered all of this information from the RTR, every club, every province has the ability to pull the same information and start to do their own tracking within their club. And I will mention this a couple of times in the presentation. I really do encourage you as the coach and you as the registrar, or if you're both, great, or working with your registrars, to become more involved in this area, especially going forward, to know where are we losing athletes, where are we gaining athletes, and perhaps even extrapolating out, like this region of our area, this part of town, we're seeing a lot of new athletes, and by the time they have to transfer to the other pool, well, now they've extended their drive a really far ways, and we're seeing that at that time athletes are dropping out of our program. Having these insights is only possible by tracking these athletes signing up and athletes leaving. So I encourage you to do that. If you would like more information as to how to engage with the RTR to gather this information and extract it out, and then perhaps even how to compile it, comparing one season to another, we use Athlete ID as the main mechanism for this. But if you are interested in this area, please do get in contact with me. I will be quite delayed here until the OTP documents are all submitted for Swimming Canada. So about mid-October, but at that time, I promise I will get back to you, and we can maybe set up a meeting to go through how to extract the information from our RTR, download it, and start to play around with it. Okay. So what we're looking at now is the female registration, retention, and loss diagram that were provided inside of our documents for Swimming Canada during the season of 2018-19. And we focused in three main areas. Here in the top left, we're looking at the number of new competitive athletes joining Swimming Canada. Again, these are all girls during the 2018-19 season. And each of these plots is a histogram. This one in the top left is the new registrations. Down bottom left, we're looking at the athletes that have left our program. So meaning they did not register again in 2018-19 after having been registered in 2017-18. And over here, this histogram is the number of athletes retained in yellow. To understand what a histogram is simply a fancy way of saying we counted things in a particular way. Along the bottom here, we're looking at the athlete ages that athletes are joining our program, and the numbers at the top of each of these bars represents the total number of athletes that have joined. So really, it's just a counting exercise, but a useful one because we can then get a better understanding of when athletes are joining, leaving, or staying inside of our programs. Our new competitive registration athletes, we broke up into 3 different categories so we could track every single athlete and know what was happening to them. We had new swimmers in dark blue to competitive swimming, meaning we've never seen these athletes before, and they signed up for competitive swimming, and these are the ages and counts that we saw them joining us. The light blue are those athletes that have transferred from pre-competitive swimming into competitive. And then the last group would be our athletes that have returned. So a pre-competitive to competitive swimmer would have been swimming in the 2017-18 season as non-competitive, and then transferred the following season into competitive, the 18-19 season. A returned athlete is an athlete who has taken at least 1 year away. So we know that they have swam in the past, and then during the 2017-18 season, they did not swim, and then re-signed up in 2018-19, just to understand a little bit of where those athletes are coming from and how many athletes are we really talking about. These more detailed breakdowns were provided to the provinces, and if you're really, really interested in how your transition rates of pre-competitive to competitive, you can talk with the PSO leads, and they may be able to help you with this. But again, I encourage you and your registrars to get involved to see what are our transition rates, what are the numbers that we're seeing in terms of new athletes coming into our program. So what can we pull out of the new competitive athletes? Well, we can see that there's really, across Canada, a general peak somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. None of this is rocket science, and I'm sure none of it is relatively new information to any of the coaches on the call today. Most of our new athletes come between the ages of 8 and 11. So your planning, your structure, the coaches that are working with them, the planning in terms of your long-term athlete development and athlete development matrix may focus more so in your intro groups, as this is the target age, because that's your largest catchment of athletes that are coming in and trying competitive swimming for the first time. On the bottom left here, we see the number of athletes that have quit by age, and we do see that there's very few athletes in the first couple of years, and then we have a peak across Canada around 12 years old, and then the numbers start to decline. Now this would make sense. There are more and more athletes joining swimming, because we have more and more athletes here in our competitive registrations. And we'll talk a little bit here just momentarily about the athletes that have retained. So it's no surprise that we see the number of athletes that quit going up and up and up until 12 years old, because this is where we have the most athletes. We have the most athletes most female athletes in swimming sometime between 11 and 12 years old. So there's just more athletes to quit. And then after that, we would hope that this would be a fairly sharp decline. But what we see sometimes in multiple years going back is that this curve is rather flat, that the number of athletes quitting sort of stays around the same number of athletes, which represents a larger and larger percentage of athletes that are leaving our program. So that would be a red flag if we were to see this happening inside of one province or another, to engage with those people and talk about, okay, what's happening at these ages? Why are these athletes leaving the program? And then lastly, the number of athletes retained, this is just more so for completeness. They had been swimming in 2017-18. They are still swimming in the 2018-19 season. And we can see that the peak ages for this happening are somewhere between 11, 12, and 13 years old for the female athletes, or at least that was the number in 2018-19. Again, I don't think that this is shocking information for anybody. If you go to a swim meet, the 11 and 12 girls category is packed. There's multiple heats. And as you get to, say, the 15 and over boys, you might see much fewer heats, but there are just less swimmers that have retained in our program, and we have next to no new swimmers at that age joining our swimming. So this is simply showing us our demographics of what we might see at a competition, and to shape our competitions as such that there may need to be able to tweak so that we can allow for 24 heats of girls 200 freestyle and only have 3 heats of male 200 freestyle. So again, not shocking information, but I think just really good to observe it and understand what year to year some of these numbers might mean. So if we're looking at Swimming Canada, this is the goal was to provide some sort of comparison. So here we're now looking at the Swim Ontario registrations. Swim Ontario represents roughly a third of Canadian registrations. So you will see what we see in the Canadian registrations. We're very likely to see a very similar pattern in the Ontario registration, simply because you make up so much of Swimming Canada. And we see a very similar pattern. Not all provinces do pre-competitive swimming, so you might see a larger band here for Swimming Ontario. We see a sharper peak at 9 and 10, so maybe not as many athletes joining swimming at the 11 and 12 years old. So this is something that could be taken away, as we don't necessarily need to focus on the 11 and 12 as the new athletes, because we just have fewer of them coming into our programs in Swim Ontario. We maybe shift our target age in terms of the program we're delivering to a slightly younger age of between 8, 9, and 10. Interesting for Swimming Ontario, the female athletes, we see a peak of athletes that are leaving our sport at 14 rather than at 12. This is a good sign to me that we have a larger time, an opportunity for more athletes to experience competitive swimming for longer. When we look at the peak age of, say, 9 or 10 here that are joining our sport, and then a peak at 14, this means they've had a couple of years to get in and try competitive swimming. And I think that the more separation we have between when we have our peak athletes coming in, say at 9, 10, 11 years old, if we can shift the peak of when we're having athletes leave our program, it would mean we're retaining athletes through those middle years for longer, and have a higher chance, I would think, of retaining those athletes long-term. They're having more success and more fun in the pool than maybe other provinces where we see the peak of our athletes coming in and the peak of athletes going out being very, very close together. That's a red flag for us. Another question that might rise here is what happens at 14 years old? So at 14 years old in 2017-18, girls are deciding that they're not interested in swimming anymore and they're not coming back in the 2018-19 season. That's an interesting question, and one we're going to touch on a little bit later in terms of, can we understand and define maybe some of the challenges that we see? Are these athletes at 14 only just signing up at 13, and we see a larger proportion of those athletes? Well, they tried it at 13, they're joining our sport pretty late, so they're then leaving our sport because they simply joined us very late and they're not enjoying it as much as, say, an athlete who joined at 8 and is now 14 years old and is used to the types of things that you do in swimming. So questions we're going to look at a little bit later. How am I doing, Stu? Is there any questions that have popped up thus far?
Not yet. Not yet. Keep plugging along.
Fancy. Awesome. Okay. And then just for completeness here, now looking at the boys curves for Swim Ontario from the 2018-2019 season. We have very similar shapes that we saw in the previous slides, where we see the highest catchment of swimmers joining Swimming Ontario competitive swimming. So again, somewhere between 8 and 11 years old, not as sharp a peak in terms of the athletes joining at, say, 9. So that may simply be a factor of we're looking at small populations, and just in that year, we just happen to pick up more 9-year-olds than typical. There's an interesting double peak inside of the athletes that have quit. And this is a peak when we look back at previous seasons of competitive swimming in Ontario, at least as far back as 2016-17 and then 17-18, we see this double peak. And it's quite interesting. It's not, huge, but there's just a bit of a peak at 12 and a bit of a peak at 14. So looking at these numbers here, which inside your programs you may also note. And it might be interesting then to dive in to what are the reasons for this? Is there something happening with boy athletes at 12 inside of school? Is there something happening inside of our programs, inside of our competitive swimming programs, that suddenly at 12 they're making a decision to leave our sport, and then 2 years later another group of athletes are making the same decision to leave the sport? So it's an interesting thing to potentially dive into. You won't notice this inside your club unless you are tracking it. So again, I do encourage you to get involved and look at it, and look at it over multiple seasons. So what I'm not going to show here, but something we did provide to the provinces was some level of normalcy. The numbers we're seeing here in competitive registrations, those that have quit and those that are retained, we did provide a 3-year summary looking at the maximum range, like what was normal for these athletes or inside of these competitive categories. How many athletes is normally joining Swimming Canada or Swim Ontario at 10 years old? What is the range of values that we've seen over the last 3 years? And then one of the takeaway points that we've got and received from several provinces was, well, can we observe the Olympic bump or a theoretical Olympic bump where we have an Olympics, swimming's all over TV? Do we have this wave of new athletes coming into our program? Or do we see more athletes being retained for one more year? It's not something we looked at inside of this report, but it is something that the provinces were interested in seeing because it's been something that people believe is there, but I'm not sure how many people have been specifically tracking. And if that is happening, what is it that we're seeing? Is it new swimmers coming in, or is it fewer swimmers quitting? And where is that happening? So again, it's something that we've taken a note of and we are interested in investigating as well. Okay. So we're going to move on. The next slide is very information dense. So I don't want you to panic, and I certainly don't want you to walk away from the screen for a little bit. What it is we're going to start to try to tease out some of the information that we've just discussed. This peak at 14 for boys, are most of those boys actually coming from 13 the year before, and they're maybe behind their peers, they're not picking up swimming as fast as those that have been swimming for multiple years, and they're the ones making the decision to quit? So we're going to be looking at years of experience across multiple ages and try to understand what is happening at these ages in terms of what percentage are quitting, and then from there, asking the provinces or asking the clubs specifically in Swim Ontario to think about what's happening. Who are these athletes, these families facing? What is happening at critical times in their development, and maybe what's happening inside of our club fees, or what's our parents' responsibilities at these ages, and is there something that we can do to help impact what is happening inside of these numbers? So that's what we're going to be looking at next, is looking at years of experience of athletes when they leave our sport, and then what does that mean? Okay, so percentages of females that quit by age, as well as by year of experience. So understanding our multiple red lines here. Along the y-axis, we're looking at percentages. These are the percentages of all of the athletes that are, say, 8 years old or 9 years old. It's the percentage that are leaving of that age. So when we talk about the 8-year-olds up here in the top left, then we're looking at athletes that have left the program at 8 and how many years of experience they had. Years of experience are along the bottom here. We're just looking at the first 5 years of experience and trying to infer what's going on within those first 5 years. So breaking down age 8 for our female athletes inside of Canada. We didn't look at this in terms of what's happening for the provinces, simply because when you have smaller and smaller populations that you're studying, then you can get population biases happening. So if we only are looking at, say, 68-year-olds inside of a province, then the fact that 6 quit or 7 quit would change these percentages quite a bit and maybe skew things a little bit more. So we needed to take these and look at a much more global look at things to try to tease out some answers, rather than having, say, 2 or 3 swimmers that have left the program at a particular age, really changing the landscape and maybe not providing us with a very clear view of what's happening at that age, because there just isn't that many athletes to study. So at 8 years old, what we see is that just over 10% of all 8-year-olds that join competitive swimming quit inside of their first year. Another, say, 3% quit after their second year. So inside of the first 2 years, we're losing about 13% of our 8-year-old girls. And then not much is happening in years 3, 4, and 5. Well, this makes sense because they simply haven't had an opportunity. They're so young. They maybe joined us at 6, they swam at 6, they swam at 7, and then they quit at 8. So that would be the first 2 years of experience that we're experiencing here. At age 9, we see very much the same thing. Nearly 10%, maybe whatever that is, 8.5 or close to 10% of our 9-year-old girls make the decision to leave our sport within their first year. And then another 5% of those girls decide that 9 years old, they're going to leave after 2 years of experience. We see this pattern for our female athletes through ages 8, 9, 10, and 11 years old. What this means is that the first 2 years for those athletes that are joining competitive swimming, so we saw inside of our peak diagrams here, between the ages of 8, 9, and 10, many athletes are making the decision to quit our sport within their first 2 years of competitive swimming experience. I think this comes back to some of the grassroots talk, and I did sit in on the grassroots talk yesterday, and it was really interesting to talk about the engagement or what is needed and what's necessary, who are the people facing these athletes and families for the first time. But I think that this may or not be something you see inside of your clubs. Maybe you have no problem retaining your 8, 9, and 10-year-olds through their first year or 2 years of swimming. Again, you wouldn't know this outside of tracking it and being sure, and you may observe it, but you may not know it because you don't have the hard data in front of you like this. But I think that across Canada, the global message is that those athletes between ages 8, 9, 10, and even 11 for our girls are making the decision to quit our sport inside of their first 2 years. Now, it's never very much. It's say 15%, somewhere between 12 and 17% in general of those first couple of years are deciding inside of 2 years to quit our sport. And that may not be a problem to you. I would ask that you simply reflect on it and say, you know what, no, that's too many athletes. We can't afford to lose that many athletes. How many great performers maybe are leaving the sport at that age, or how many of my future best coaches are leaving the sport at 8, 9, and 10 inside of our first 2 years. These are people that will reflect fondly or maybe not as fondly on swimming inside of their first 2 years of experiencing competitive swimming. So I've sort of flogged that one enough. Looking at ages 12, 13, and 14, we start to see a transitioning happening. The transition is that we're not seeing as many new athletes at 12 and not as many new athletes at 13 joining our sport. So we're starting to see this decline in the number of first-year athletes that are quitting competitive swimming. What we are seeing is that at these ages, it doesn't seem to matter what ages we're looking at. We're seeing those athletes at that age are leaving our sport. They're quitting at, say, after 1 year's experience. They're quitting after 5 years experience, but they're all quitting at, say, 12 or 13. Or at least we're starting to see this flatlining across the percentages of athletes that are leaving our sport. So this may be athletes are having to focus at this age on multiple sports. The fees in the club increase dramatically. The time demands on the athlete or the parents or whatever is going up, and athletes are making the decision to leave the sport at this age. But whatever it is, this would be an age that I would want to investigate as a club or as a province as to what is happening and understanding these demographic shifts away from, okay, it's not necessarily the first year athletes that we need to be really focused on and delivering a fun and exciting and really high catchment strategy at 12 and 13. It's more so focused on not years of experience, but on the age itself. That this is the age we're starting to see a transition away from athletes leaving our program. And it's this age, regardless of the years of experience that they have, they're making the decision there. So different philosophies and different challenges to tackle. When we look at the boys' information, it's very, very similar. So percentage of males that quit by year of experience. Again, at 8, at 9, and at 10, we're seeing very high numbers of first and second year of athletes that are choosing to leave our sport. At age 12 and 13, we're starting to see all those years of experience start to tick up and starting to level out. Makes sense. We're not seeing as many boys at 12 and boys at 13 that are joining competitive swimming for the first time. This would include, sorry, I should have mentioned, this would include any non-competitive athletes or pre-competitive athletes that transferred into competitive swimming. They would be counted inside of these numbers, but their year of experience would have started with their pre-competitive sign-up years. But regardless, by about age 13, we see that the flat line is happening, that athletes at 13 or at 14 are making the decision there that swimming is no longer for them, regardless of year of experience. So it's more about tackling the challenges at that age rather than looking at, okay, well, that swimmer was new, or, you know, we're going to lose that swimmer because they are inside of their first year of experience. We didn't provide a more meaningful experience to them inside of their first year. Okay, I'm a little bit over schedule here, so I'm going to try to go through the next little bit a little bit quicker here. Pre-competitive registrations. The reason I'm happy to go through this a little bit faster is the information's very easy to understand. And not all competitive programs, not all provinces do pre-competitive swimming. So we didn't have national pictures to look at because there are several provinces that simply do not have pre-competitive as an option in the registration. And even those provinces that do, it's only particular clubs inside of that province that are doing any kind of pre-competitive training. Some just simply have competitive. So it's difficult to draw a national picture across all clubs as to what this looks like. But what I would encourage you to consider here is that with pre-competitive swimming, do our pre-competitive programs need more attention, or do they need less? And I hope that this question becomes more clear as we look at some of this information. Does it need more investment? Does it need more a higher catchment? Is there more things that we need to throw at this competitive group, pre-competitive group, to have a more likely athlete that's going to stay with swimming for, you know, between 8 and 18 and invest how many thousands of dollars into your club and just registration fees alone, and plus maybe, you know, keep another group of athletes together because they're all friends? Or do we need to spend less time and understand what's happening inside of this program? We actually don't necessarily need to do more. We may need less attention, less resources thrown at this type of program. This, of course, also comes down to club budget and what you see this line item as. Is it something that you really need inside your club? Or is it something that you can maybe trim or understand, just, okay, well, this is a normal thing for us to observe, and we're going to spend a little bit less time on it because it's not going to change anything. Okay, so we're looking again at a histogram here, similar to the previous slides. We're looking at the number of athletes that are quitting our sport from pre-competitive registrations. So understanding what we're looking at here, we've got all our female athletes counted here in red, all our male athletes in blue. The percentage of total female pre-competitive swimmers that registered that quit, meaning in 2017-18, we have, say, 2,000 swimmers. In 2018-19, we had 44% or 45% of those swimmers not show up. So in order, just to keep the math simple here, let's say it was 50%. If we had 2,000 swimmers in pre-competitive in 1 year, 50% of them, 1,000 swimmers, are quitting and not coming back next year. And we have to find another 1,000 new swimmers to come in to replace them just to maintain the 2,000 numbers we had the year before. And I think that that's very normal. We do see a lot of that happening across provinces, particularly with those that really invest in non-competitive categories or have large numbers of these. We see this extremely high dropout rate. And understanding this dropout rate a little bit more, most of those athletes are quitting. 62, 63% of all the athletes that do quit from pre-competitive make that decision in 1 year. The next big chunk happens after year 2, and then after that, it drops off quite a bit. So we're seeing the same pattern. This isn't shocking because a lot of these athletes would be somewhere between the ages of, say, 6 to 10 years old. And we know that that is a pattern even in competitive swimming, that athletes make the decision to stay in swimming or not inside of their first 2 years of competitive or pre-competitive experience. These athletes that we're looking at here have quit. This is not the athletes that have quit pre-competitive and joined competitive swimming. That's another group entirely. So just giving thought to this, normal values of pre-competitive athletes that quit from year to year range anywhere from 44% to almost 50%. And they're making that decision inside of 1 year of experience. Looking at the total number of athletes from pre-competitive that transfer to competitive from 1 year to the next, we can see again that the number of females here is about 21%, or at least it was in the 2018-19 season for Swim Ontario. And then the total number of boys is just under 20% here. So only 20% are making that transition. I say only, but someone may say like, yay, we've had 20% transition from pre-competitive to competitive. And that's, you know, better than what we've seen in the past. And that'd be fantastic if it was. And then what is happening? Well, 64% make that decision after a single year of pre-competitive, and then they're transferring into competitive. The next big chunk is happening here in year 2. And so this is why I think that it's important to consider, do we need to spend more time with this group or more resources to have an impact, or do we need less? Understanding that if you have a pre-competitive pool school program and your plan is to take that 6-year-old over the next 5 or 6 years and transition them into competitive swimming, there's a very, very high likelihood that you're going to have missed those athletes over the final years of your preschool pool school program, starting at say 6 years old. Because at 6 and 7, they've either made the decision that they're going to competitive swim, but more likely they've decided they're leaving competitive swimming altogether. They're not interested. So I would say that probably looking at a 2, maybe 3-year, but a 2-year window of transitioning athletes in and making that really exciting for pre-competitive athletes if the plan is to try to keep pre-competitive swimmers in your swimming programs. Because we haven't seen this in the past, that there's a very high pre-competitive long-term strategy that's been paying off. We see, you know, at a club level, that may be true, but in terms of a provincial level, we simply aren't seeing it beyond 2 years. So does it need more attention? Can you do more? Can you have more exciting coaches, more exciting program to help keep more athletes in pre-competitive or transition them over? Or do you need to spend less time with this group in terms of, I want to develop a 5 or 6 year plan for my pre-competitive program that might be energy best spent somewhere else? So we're going to close off the registration summary here. Again, coming back to the strongly encouraging clubs, registrars, if not you as the head coach, or delegating it to another coach, more responsibility of tracking year over year what is happening in our club. How many competitive athletes do we have? Are we losing them at a particular age? How many are transitioning from pre-competitive to competitive? And you can do this using Athlete ID in our RTR system. In the ages of 8 to 11 is where we see the most athletes joining our program, but it's also in those ages that we see athletes making the decision to stay competitive inside of competitive swimming after 1 or 2 years. So thinking about the grassroots program yesterday, what do we need to do to keep those coaches exciting, to keep the program exciting? Can we have a deeper hook that keeps more athletes in the water? Is there an age inside of your clubs that we see more athletes simply quitting regardless of years of experience? They could have 6 years of experience by 12, maybe 2 years of experience by 12, but 12 seems to be the age that we really have athletes leaving the program. What is happening? What can we do about it? And then similar for the 8 to 11 years old, the pre-competitive losses very high, somewhere between 45 and 50%. Inside of their first 2 years is when they're making their decision to either stay in swimming or quit. So one of the things we can talk about in terms of questions would be exit surveys. And we've, as a provincial coach in Saskatchewan, this was a question that came up. And is it a club responsibility? Is it a provincial responsibility? Is it a national responsibility? Should be Swimming Canada sending out a survey to every single quit athlete? What happens? Where's the granularity of that? Like, is the same thing going to be seen, say, in downtown Toronto as it is just outside of Thunder Bay, in terms of, well, it was too expensive to swim or it was too far to travel? Those questions become less meaningful the farther away you get than at a club level, where you would maybe understand that our region, our postal codes all come from within one very small region of space versus from well outside. So whose responsibility is this? And hopefully some of you have gotten on this already. And then I'm just going to leave you with one more thing around registration, is that we recently had a technical leaders call. So all of the provincial coaches and executive directors, if they care to join us, were in on this call and talking about what's been happening inside their programs and inside of their province as we transition from a pandemic to post-pandemic, what's happening. And one of the things that came out from one of the provincial leads was that a large club in their province, had noticed that there was a gap in their registration, not inside of their groups, but in specific ages between 10 and 12 years old, that we see a gap and we don't know what's happening with that. And right away, the alarm bells went off, and we had a very quick discussion with all the provinces on this. Is if you do observe a gap, you now know you are in control of the information that between ages of 8 and 11. That is when most athletes join our program. If you have a gap at, say, 10 to 12 years old, that is a gap that will exist inside of your program for years as it echoes on through time, because we don't get new 12-year-olds. We don't get new 13-year-olds, and we certainly don't see them stay. So if you do observe a gap like this coming through your club and you're like, oh, well, we'll see what happens, please don't sit on it. Form a phone tree, get your membership involved, and see what's going on. Can you pull some of these athletes back that are 10, 11, 12 years old? Is there anything you can do to try to pull these athletes back into your program? Because those ages will not be filled going forward. We don't see new registrations happening at that time. So I just want to share that with everybody, that if you do observe this, actively try to recruit if that's within your means, because I know that there is so much going on. Okay, this is where I want to take a quick break if you want to go for a water break, or I'll turn to Stu now to see if there's anything in the chat. We'll take 1 or 2 minutes here. Again, I'm a little bit behind my schedule, and we'll move more quickly here through the peak performance and performance information.
No, Aaron, no questions in the chat. There was a comment, though. I posed the question to the group about, do pre-competitive programs need more or less attention? Shannon Morrison from Crest made a great comment. So pre-competitive needs more attention. The cost and time associated with competitive can be a barrier to entry. Families may be hesitant to commit those resources until they know their young athletes will enjoy it, and be prepared to commit themselves to the sport.
Right on. Good observation.
Yeah, it's a great comment. Thanks, Shannon. Okay, guys, we'll give you 1 or 2 minutes here, and then Aaron's going to jump in on the peak performance and peak to peak performance. And again, feel free to throw those questions into the chat. I'll bump in and pose them to Aaron. If not, we can certainly do that at the end.
All right. If everybody's ready, which I can't see any of you, I hope you're all ready. We'll jump back into peak performance and peak-to-peak performance and discuss what that means and how it was measured, and then some of the things that we can draw from there. I think we've got about 35 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. So I'll try to get through this fairly quickly without glazing over too many things or going too quickly and missing some of the key information. And then we'll have some time at the end for questions. And again, you can always reach out to me if you have questions about this kind of thing that you think of after the session. Then you can reach out to me via email and we'll try to set something up. Just allow me that time, a couple of weeks until I will get back to you in terms of setting up a time to chat. But that chat may happen sort of towards mid or late October. Okay, so looking at peak performance and peak-to-peak performance. What are we talking about? Who are we talking about? And what was measured? So we studied national level athletes, meaning those athletes that were eligible to compete at an Easterns or Western Championships or above as of the Eastern and Western deadline, and what would be a reasonable or what is the entry point for those athletes to come in. So we tracked who had those time standards from the prior season through the season in question. So say in 2019, we would have allowed all long course performances from 2018 and all long course performances in 2019 up till I believe it was the end of March or whatever the March deadline was. And then we were considering those athletes. Those athletes were our national group of athletes to study. We felt that those athletes are the most likely ones to be competing a peak to peak or be swimming in a year-round competitive swimming program. So from September to July, maybe even August. We looked at evaluating personal bests and what their performance was relative to their personal best. The personal bests that we measured were all measured from the previous season so that we could compare apples to apples. If you're familiar with high tech and you're looking at a best time report, one of the challenges with high tech is that it doesn't matter when the most recent performance was. You could be comparing to something that happened 3 weeks before, and another athlete might have been 3 months before, and then another athlete from the previous year. And you'd be trying to gauge, okay, well, was that a great performance or not relative to their previous best? So in order to set this up, we simply looked at, say, the 2019 season. No 2019 swims were considered as a previous best. We only looked at swims from the previous season or prior to as a previous best time, so that all athletes had at least a year of competitive training in order to measure their performance or how much they have improved. For the peak performance, we're looking at summer competitions, July and August. And when we look at peak to peak, then that's familiar. Our Swimming Canada definition of peak would be the March-April window and then the July-August window. Those are our 2 peaks that we would be measuring. In order to understand what would be the athlete's best events, we use the percentage relative to the FINA A standard. It simply wouldn't be feasible for us to get in contact with every coach and swimmer at this level. 1,500 or so females, 1,500 or so athletes, and asking, okay, what did you think your best event was? Could you list your best 3? So we made the decision to look at those events that were the most close to the FINA A standard or the most beyond the FINA A standard to define their best events, and we tracked their 3 best events. Now, we did have a discussion on previous calls that maybe we need to understand this population a little bit better. One gender much closer to the FINA A than, say, another, and does that play a factor? And that's something we will look forward to studying those statistics in the future. Or is 3 events too many? Well, we made this decision because we're primarily looking at, say, 13-year-old girls and up, where most of the athletes are between the age of 13 and 18. That this is an age group style program, and looking at a multiple events for them is not unreasonable. For boys, say 14 and over, again, the bulk of the athletes are in their mid-teens to late teens. So perhaps specializing with a single event, but point taken, we will look at a single best event and see how those statistics change, and is that what we want to see, that an athlete is only improving in one event versus all of their other events. Again, is another discussion for future investigation. So when we talk about tracking improvement from previous year to their best result, we're looking at any competition. inside of those windows. So in this, when we talk about peak performance, we're talking about the summer peak and trying to understand any swim we took their best swim, gave the athlete as many chances as they had inside of prelims, finals, multiple competitions, just took their best swim to compare back to their previous result. We gave the athlete the most opportunity. We didn't just look at Canadian juniors or just look at trials. We looked at all swims. So they could have gone to a time trial, a provincial championship, anything where they would have had the opportunity to really be focused inside of the peak performance window of the summer, or peak to peak being spring to summer, and gave them the best shot. And this is what we found. So peak performance improvement counts. We're only looking at, again, this histogram, which is a fancy way of saying we're counting athletes inside of different performance bands. On the left side, the histogram is for our women and the total number of swims. And then our men on the right here and their total number of swims. Understanding these axes, we're looking at either performance regressing, so their percentage, they added a percentage of time to their previous best. So there would be positive numbers here, or those athletes that have improved. So the percentage of improvement here. And we simply broke this into 1% bands. We looked at athletes that have improved on the women's side, the number of swims between 0% and 1%. Oh, we had 227 performances of our national group that improved by 0 to 1%. We had a further 174 performances that improved from 1% to 2%. The information we're looking at here is the 2018-19 season. So you should see these numbers match up with the numbers over here. Now, what isn't exciting to see is the total numbers and what are total percentages. We feel that this is one of the key challenges for Canada to move forward in the future. Of all of the female performances, of which we had 1,500 swims from our national group, only 58% of them improved, meaning 42% of all the swims showed some form of regression. On the men's side, we have a better story. We see almost 70% of the swims improved from previous season. And we obviously had close to 30% that did not. What we found interesting, again, this is our summer performances that we're looking at here, is that this, regardless of the season that we looked at, we continue to see this large difference between male and female athletes over the years. So almost always we're seeing a 10% difference between our female athletes in terms of the number of performances that they're achieving at a personal best level and our male athletes. So starting to think about how do we prepare our athletes for that summer peak? Are they all doing the same thing? Is that what's going to help those athletes improve through the summer peak? If they're all doing the same thing, then I would say historically with this group of athletes, we're not seeing the females respond to the same training as the males, or the raising themselves to the peak competition. I don't know what it is, and this is important for this discussion, is I can only point to the information and say this is what's happening. I can't necessarily say what are the root causes. We can always guess, but I don't want to guess. I want you as the coaches to be informed and then make decisions about what you're doing going forward based on previous information. That, okay, this has been a problem in our club. We match the Swim Ontario, Swim Canada numbers in terms of our female performances come the summer peak, and our male performances, I'm going to do something different and try to impact those numbers in a positive way. For Swim Ontario now, this is the same year, the 2018-19 season. We again see a similar response. We see the same kind of numbers for Swim Ontario as we did to Swim Canada. The percentages are very, very close. Again, this is not surprising, simply because Swim Ontario makes up about 1/3 of all of the Easterns and Westerns qualified athletes or higher. And so we shouldn't expect to see great differences in the percentages that we observe competing to new personal bests. So this is, again, the number of swims that athletes are achieving new personal bests. Female athletes here at 55% in 2019, and our male athletes very, very close to the 70% mark. So 70% of all of those performances come the summertime are improving. something.
Aaron, can I just jump in here for a second?
Yeah.
I've got a question from the chat. I think the first question is related to the registration and retention piece. So, are the rates of dropout similar between sports per relative ages? And then the secondary question, I think, how does it compare with the last 5 to 10 years?
Great questions. The first is something that we would like to have a really good discussion with other sports. Our RTR system is quite robust in terms of the information that we have and how long we've been tracking it. I'm not aware of what other national sports organizations have done in this area. And once we get through our past Olympics here and the next Olympic cycle, that is a target for us on the high performance side, is to reach out. We have worked with Athletics Canada in the past and shared how we do some of our gap analysis and how we're using, say, the on-track times as to how track and athletics use their version of on-track times, because we're both using Canadian Tire as someone to assist us with our performance identification. So it's something we do want to dive into. We're not aware of any other national sport organization that has done this kind of in-depth research. I believe Rowing Canada recently came out with a document outlining where rowing is happening versus not rowing is happening. So this is good because this is something we want to investigate with them. So it's likely going to be we've done this, what have you done kind of conversation. But that is the hope, to understand. And further, my hopes would be to say, we've got some great athletes leaving our sport at 13 years old. And they've decided they don't like swimming, but they might make a great rower. And, conversely, are there rowers that are leaving your sport at, say, 11 or whatever, and they would actually make great swimmers? And try to look to share that kind of information. So great question around that. It is on our vision going forward, but we haven't done something like that yet. Mostly everything was put on hold, and then the Olympics really make everybody very busy. And of course, we've got the 2022 Olympics coming up, and we're hoping to work with Speed Skating Canada as well in a few areas. But we don't want to try to jump in while they're approaching their very critical competition. So Stu, I think that was the first question. What was the second question again?
The second question was, how does it compare with the last 5 to 10 years? And I believe that I can maybe answer some of that in the presentations you gave to us, is that this is sort of the first catchment of this information that you can then develop and look back to previous years. And I can't remember, but I believe that was the intention at some point.
Yeah, I mean, and of course the pandemic came right in and screwed a lot of that up because we need the information in the RTR. We don't have any results to track. We don't have any registrations potentially to track. So we've got a big gap. Now we did a 3-year window, and that was sort of our first attempt at looking at what is normal. And we did share that with the provinces in individual age gaps. So 10 years old and 11 years old, what's normal to be coming into our sport, what's normal to be leaving our sport. Going back as far as 10 to 15 years, no, we haven't done that. And there's also RTR challenges with that because the number of competitive registration statuses have changed over the years. So it was safe to look back to 2016, 17, but did we call competitive or pre-competitive the same thing that we do now? Do we have a varsity registration group? There are many evolutions that have come forward. So probably won't be going that far back, but certainly going forward, looking at least at the last quad, and then having this kind of report annually done over the next 5 years would give us a really good picture as to what is normal and perhaps what are the things we're implementing now that we would like to see in 5 years' time. Did that have the intended impact, right? For example, changing competitive structure for long-term athlete development reasons and removing some events or putting in more events at this age group. What is the intended impact and how do we measure it? A lot of those challenges have been, we can't measure it. We're simply basing it on literature and our inferences of that literature and what's a best practice and what we should be doing. With this kind of information, we're hoping to help monitor. We implemented this and we see absolutely no difference. We see this crazy difference. That's what we're hoping we can draw out, and then rely on professional statisticians to help us pull this information apart to say, you actually have a significant difference here, even though those two populations look exactly the same. So good questions. I encourage more of them if you have them, and it's a point of moving forward for sure.
Okay, and I've got one that sort of leads into the previous slides, with regards to the performance from Kevin Anderson. He asks, is some of this maturation related?
Great question. We will touch on that a little bit later. We are looking at, say, on the screen right now, we have the total number of swims for women, but none of this is broken down by age. This is strictly women versus men. We know that the Eastern National qualifiers start at, say, 13 years old for girls, and on the boys' side, it starts at 14 years old. Looking at the expected improvement curves will help us with this. We know that those age groups typically improve at roughly the same rate, I'd say 13-year-old girls and 14-year-old boys, but the girls plateau a little bit sooner in terms of their development, whereas boys seem to maintain 2% per year, thereabouts, improvement through their late teenage years, or that's what we would expect to have seen. So great question. We will touch on that in a little bit. This plot doesn't necessarily show those numbers. This is strictly the raw data of the number of athletes that we're looking at that are women or men. But we will get to that. So that's a great forward thinking there, Kevin. Any other questions, Stu?
Let's jump back in.
Great. So just wanted to cover off, we're not seeing any great differences here from Swim Ontario in 2018-19 in terms of the number of performances that have improved from previous year. We do look at the para results as well, and we have different ways of looking at para information in case there are any para coaches on the call, and I hope there are. But with the para athletes and para number of swims, that are athletes that are competing in a year-round peak-to-peak program, the numbers start to drop off. And when that happens, we end up with population biases. Like, there's simply not a lot of athletes, and we can't infer from a global standpoint what is happening. It could be that, the 66 swims are coming from 22 athletes, of which this program had to shut down for 5 months, and they had 6 of the 22 athletes. Well, that's going to have a major impact on our statistics and trying to infer what's going on. And certainly we can look at the para women in 2018-19. Of the total 66 swims that we were able to evaluate over that summer in 2019, only 36% improved. Where on the male side, we had roughly 30 swimmers. Of their 92 swims, we had 63% improvement. So it matches more of our male swims. You may be scratching your head thinking like, oh my God, like what is happening with our para female program? Like, oh, this is terrible. But if you look at, say, the 2018-19 season, or sorry, the 2017-18 season, we can see that we had roughly the same numbers of women, a few less men performing. The men's results look very much the same. Our women's results shot up 20%. So this is where we see some big fluctuations simply due to the population sizes of these competitive athletes. What we don't see often in the Olympic side of things, or don't talk about in the Olympic side of things, is simply that there are degenerative challenges facing some of our Paralympic athletes, that their impairment will continue to decline and such affect their performance. And Wayne Lomas, who will be talking during this conference, if he hasn't spoken already, may talk about some of those challenges and how we address personal bests. Do we look at lifetime best? Do we look at their lifetime best since they changed classification, which is the way that Swimming Canada has decided to go in terms of evaluating personal bests in this grouping, which wasn't the way we did it during this. We just looked at raw data. So it's more so a slide to say that we are working to better understand what's happening inside of our para programs. We look at points, we look at best times, we're looking at those that are changing classification and how often does that happen. But just to say, from this slide alone, we can see that there's similar patterns between our Paralympic and Olympic programs, but we can't necessarily make a very strong argument towards that simply because of population changes and so few swimmers that are swimming a year-round competitive swimming program. Okay, so moving on a little bit here from peak to peak, what are we observing here? So these are athletes that are in year-round competitive swimming programs that are swimming and competing in March and April, and we take their best performance from that time frame to any of those performances. So it could have happened at a provincial meet, an invitational, a time trial, a national meet. If it was their best long course performance, then that's the event performance we took, and then we compared that to the July-August performance of those athletes. Okay, so that's important. It's any of their best performances. We really did want to give the athletes the best benefit of the doubt to see can they improve. And there's, summer meets there are typically very crowded. We've got provincials followed 2 weeks later by a Canadian juniors, followed by a nationals, followed by maybe a tour team or a Canada Games or something happening. So there's a lot of different opportunities there. Instead of looking at the total number of swims, we look at that as well for peak to peak, but I thought I would just show you a different way that we were observing the information, which was to average the athletes' performances. So we took their best 3 swims or their best 2 swims if they say didn't swim an event between the spring and the summer. We didn't try to add a new event in. We just looked at their best 3 as a percentage of FINA A. And then if they didn't swim that event later on in the summer, then they simply went forward with 2 swims. So that would be why you see not an equal distribution of, say, the number of 542 women competing, and then whatever 3 times that number is, moving forward 1,606 or whatever, 626. The percentages here mean the same thing. So this is the average improvement that has regressed from 0 to 1%, from 1% to 2%, and vice versa here. The average improvement of the athlete over their 3 events or 2 events from 0 to 1%. And what we're seeing in 2018-19 was not the most positive thing we've seen inside of Canadian swimming, that over half of our performances that swam in the spring versus the summer, they did not improve in the summer. So over half those swims didn't improve from spring to summertime. And I'm sure that that's not what the athletes were intending or programs were intending. They didn't spend 14 more weeks in the water or 12 weeks more in the water to try to get slower come the summer meet. Looking back in time, we see that those numbers are different than 2019. So something going on in 2019 may have been impactful. We don't know for sure. We're just observing it in these results, but we're looking at multiple different swim meets. So there's no single reason that we can clearly identify, but it is something that we're observing and digging into farther. In 2018, 2017, we're not seeing huge shifts. I mean, it's better. We're over 50% improvement. We're not seeing the differences between male and female populations that we saw looking year over year. But we are seeing fairly low numbers in terms of the number of swims that are improving from spring to summer. Less than what we saw year over year. We're not expecting, say, in the previous years, when we're looking at comparing to the previous year's results from one summer to the next summer, where we're seeing some athletes achieving like 4% or 5% improvement. Just seeing some improvement between 0 and 1%, 0 and 2%. We think that might be reasonable based on the athletes that are in the water, but we're seeing more often than not very few athletes improving spring to summer. At least in 2019, more athletes that were not. In the previous years, we had more athletes that were improving in general, but maybe not as many as we would like to have seen. So this was Swimming Canada's data in 2019. Looking at Swim Ontario's data, we see 35% across the board of number of swims that were improving. So Ontario a little bit off form in 2019, below the national average. This is, I wanted to flag here that we're only using results in July and August. So if you had an exceptional provincials in Ontario, but those results were finished in June, they aren't included in this study. So that's where some of our provincial differences, it's important to look at one province against themselves rather than against other provinces to understand what is happening in terms of those dynamics. If we look at the 2018 season though, we see that Ontario has improved more than the national average. So again, looking back in time, also very important. So the question earlier, are we comparing to 5 or 10 years back? No, but we're looking at least in a reasonable amount of the last quad, where we have really good access to information and the ability to track athletes in terms of what is normal. So this is good, but it's maybe not as what you would expect. And is there something we can do about that in the design of our programs when we're competing, when we're not competing? The types of things that impact athletes as the weather gets warmer, and how can we excite both at a national level, inside the clubs, inside the province, make the summertime meet as exciting as possible to raise the game and see more improvement than in the springtime. All the questions and not new questions. I know that many have posed those questions before. And certainly at a provincial level, when we have these meetings face-to-face via Zoom, obviously, we've had those conversations and gone through that. I'm going to move on to the rates of improvement looking by age. So this comes back to Kevin's point. And we're going to be investigating something here called a box and whisker plot. I'll give you a quick rundown on how these work. And I find them to be a very powerful way of looking at population distributions. Population distributions, and we'll go through how we can understand this better, because there's some really impactful, meaningful things that we can extract from here. On the y-axis, we're looking at, again, our friend, the percentage improvement. When we're looking at the previous year to our summer performances, how much did we improve or regress? So a positive percentage would be regression. The athlete performance got slower than the previous year. Negative percentages mean the athlete has improved. There's a percentage improvement from the previous year. And then we're going to be looking at athletes by age as they perform from one year to the next. So our athletes here at 14 years old, we're looking at men's performances. So their times from 13 to 14, and what kind of performance ranges did we see? In Canada, those athletes that did swim both spring and summer, we had 31 males at an Eastern's national level performing, so probably somewhere close to 90 performances. And the range of performances are somewhere inside of this box and whisker plot. Now, what does this mean? If we take all 90 performances that those athletes did, and we line them all up from most improved to least improved, and we aimed right at the middle, that's called the median. The median is the 50% mark, and that's a really useful measure for us, because it means that half of the performances were better than whatever that median was. It's right in the middle. So, and then the other half would be slower than that point. Every time you see an orange line here on the graph, that is the median performance. It's the middle performance of all of the swims that were done by that age. The box here represents the 25th and 75th percentile. You don't need to know what the 25th and 75th percentile means outside of when you line up all of those performances, again, from most improved to least improved, and you go 25% down the line, that would be your 25th percentile. You keep going, you get to the median, that's the 50% mark. And if you keep going to the 3/4 mark, that is your 75th percentile. Why is this useful information? Well, it tells us that in between these two spots on the plot, that's where 50% of our information lies. So if that information is very close together, then we know that 50% of all the performances were somewhere between, say, 4% and 7.5% improvement. So that's great. That's what's happening for most of our performances. The outliers here, these extremes, represent the other 25th percentiles. So our least improved swimmer was here, our most improved swimmer performance is here, and thus we have a distribution that we can look at and understand, okay, this is where the middle was, this is where most of the swims are between that 25th inside the box, and then these are where the extremes are. If something was truly extreme, say an athlete swam in the summer the previous year and swam lights out, and the next year broke their arm and came back and swam again the next summer and had a 30% regression, we did not include those statistics. The width of the statistics that we would consider in terms of what was a reasonable amount or what was extraneous has to do with the relationship of this width of the box. So if it was well outside of a certain percentage of that box and whisker plot, then we just considered it. But there's, I say this just to glance over it, there weren't very many performances to exclude in that regard on either side, most improved or in the least side. Okay, so what do we do with this information? Well, this tells us then the range of performances by individual athletes at these ages and where the middle and where the 50% of those performances were happening. So at 15, we can see that somewhere around 2.5% to 5% was our middle improvement. We can expect that a lot of our performances fell inside of there. This red line is an expected improvement curve. And this isn't something that Swimming Canada pulls out of the air. Again, we're coming back to some of the information provided by our friends at Canadian Tire, who looked at the top 30 athletes in the world in any given year and traced their development by using FINA, by using swim rankings, and any other database that they could scrape and compile all of these athlete histories together so that we could have a really solid understanding of what is the median performance, what is a reasonable expectation for improvement, given that this is what the best swimmers in the world are capable of doing at that age. It's not looking at their raw times, looking specifically at how much they were able to improve year over year. And when we look at, say, a median performance over all different events for a particular gender, we end up with this smooth curve here. Now, it does fluctuate when you look at the actual data, as you would expect, that the bumps, there's a little bit bumpy at different ages. But when you simply draw a median line through it to reduce the greatest possible error comparing the median to the raw data, this is the kind of curve that you receive. So it's a good measure for us to understand what it would be a reasonable amount of improvement to expect. And with all that said, what we can see is that our median line, the orange lines here, closely line up with our expected improvement, which is great through the ages of 14, 15, even at 16, we're just starting to drift a little bit here on the men's side. But something is happening, doesn't matter what year we look at, going back as far as 2016, at about 16 or 17 years old, we start to see our median line drifting away from our expected rate of improvement. We're seeing fewer and fewer performances meeting that expected improvement line. And it happens inside of our age group programs, right? At 17, 16 years old, 17 years old, they're still in high school, they're still in club programs. They're not at a varsity level or in a professional setting for the most part. So at 17, 18, 19, we're starting to see that only 25% of the performances, just looking at the bottom of the box and down, are meeting those expected improvements, at least on the men's side. When we look at the women's improvements, again, we're looking at the number of performers here and what's their distribution of performances relative to their best time. Our 13-year-olds in 2019, they were killing it. Nearly 75% of all of their performances were better than our expectations, which is fantastic. If we could have Canadian swimming doing this every year, we would have an extremely impressive national program going forward. But it's the same story here, that about 16 years old, we start to see just a bit of a drift, that our median improvement of athletes is drifting away from the expected improvement line of where international top 30 in the world by event athletes were able to achieve. And by 17, we're starting to see that much, much closer to the bottom of the box. Only 25% of our performances are achieving the expected rate of improvement that we've been given to from Canadian Tire. We do see that this line also plateaus earlier than in the men's line, which I started talking to when Kevin asked his question. So just a quick performance summary and areas that we thought were the most pertinent to challenges to try to address going forward right before everything shut down. We were working with the provinces in late 2019 and early 2020. Our women are achieving about 10% fewer personal bests in the summertime than men compared to their previous year's personal best. We thought that was something that could be flagged right away and investigated inside of our national competitive programs. Roughly half of our swimmers improved from spring to summer in terms of their number of performances. So what can we shift and adjust there on all sides, on our provincial side, on our national side, at a club level, in the training environment, to try to shift those numbers to be a little bit higher. And then after 16 years of age, fewer athlete performances are meeting the expected rate of improvement. Now on the women's side at 16, 17, 18, it's around 1% as the percentage of improvement that we would expect. On the male side, it's closer to 2% and then dropping as you get older to about 1%. But those are some of the key flags that we saw jump out at us right away inside of a very, very large and very, very dense document. The key takeaways for everybody we thought here, again, from the registration side, looking to understand our club registration, you must engage with your registrar and understand that information and start to play around with it and extract some of the key information in order to make evidence-based decisions for your club going forward around registration. Are there strategies that we need to discuss for 8 to 11 inside of the first 2 years? Is there a bottleneck inside your club where regardless of year of experience, you start to see that age of athlete leaving your club and our sport? Our women are achieving fewer personal bests. I've gone over those final points there, and I know I'm getting close to the end of my time here. So I'll leave those on the board, and I'll leave it open to questions now from Stu. But as I do, I want to say thank you to everybody. It's a really dense amount of information and a lot of histograms, a lot of counting to go through. And I hope that there was at least a few nuggets of useful information that you haven't seen before, or reinforce what you have imagined but not had the data to see, or maybe it's just all been a really good review and you're happy to have it. I hope so.
Thanks, Aaron. We do have a couple of questions. So Kevin, back to Kevin Anderson. Do you know if other federations have similar insights? In terms of
a lot of other federations hide their data. So all the ones that we would be really interested in, the larger nations, or at least have similar sizes to Canadian swimming, it's difficult to get their information outside of looking at either FINA, which is only FINA sanctioned events, and a lot of age group competitions wouldn't have those. So we can't dig into their those rates of improvement or not. And then Australia and the US and UK swimming, they all hide it just like we do. You have to have a username and a password to gain access to it. And although it's something we're attempting to dig into regardless of what is available to us at face value.
Okay, and from Dean Bowles, have you been able to determine the influences of these declining rates?
I think that there's no single factor, and as you move meets every year or move from pool to pool, how many lanes are available between heats and finals, there's lots of different things to dig into. As I wanted Stu to mention at the beginning of this, my background's in physics and applied math, and I've moved into the area of data science and analysis. My area of expertise is not statistics. So when we come up to a really challenging situation like this, where we would need, say, a nonlinear regression model to identify all of the different variables that could be in place, do we need to feed this over to Canadian Tire for a machine learning model to tell us what are the most impactful things to Canadian performances? These are still in the big idea phase. We would hesitate to say it is a single thing. There are many factors, and certainly many factors we simply can't control, that are national. Looking at all of the clubs across Canada, what does a national program look like? Are they swimming 5 times a week for 3 hours of practice? Are they swimming 10 times a week for an hour each? A lot of things we can't control. So I would say that a lot of the things that maybe you review inside of your yearly training plans or are working to in your athlete development models, you may see something in there that I want to tweak. I want to change the volume my female athletes are doing right after Easterns and Westerns. I want to make a change. I would say that would be more so relying internally on what you've seen. Is it what you expected to see from your athletes? And then make a change and see, an educated change based on the information you have available to you. So yes and no. I think there's 2 parts to that. I think that it would be really great to have a more detailed statistical analysis of some of those key questions. But at the same time, when you get down to the club level and you're working with your group of, say, 4 athletes, 5 athletes, what we find is the most impactful points may not be what's reflected inside of your training group.
So I have a question for you. In terms of the use of this data by, say, Swimming Canada, we all know that there's the anomalies of the Summer McIntoshes and the Katrina Bellios of the world. But I'm wondering, when you start to track back for the ideal world-class performance, where are you really centering your focus in terms of age? Is it in that 15, 16-year-old range where you're really trying to pull out where these kids are going to end up?
That's a great question. There's no one answer. I think one of the greatest tools that we've been provided from our friends at Canadian Tire Analytics was the development of our on-track times, and with the understanding of that there are different ages for peak performance inside of different events. And we've continued to track that. We have this is one of the databases we actually rely on to go back as far back as 2000. And we have been tracking what is the average age in the final, what is the median age in the final, how do those things differ, and what have we observed. And we've now shifted the next phase of on-track times that we have available is the most up-to-date best guess moving forward at what is the median age to be in that final. And we know that there are differences in, say, the females distance and the men's 50 freestyle. We don't necessarily see the same shift in ages. Some of our male events are actually getting younger. Some of our female events are getting a little bit older. We're hedging our bets in both areas, and we've allowed ourselves to move on track times by a single year to try to stay ahead of this. If you're looking for a guide, I would say that those are the guides to use. Would be, where does on track start in terms of a particular age? What is a reasonable amount of improvement? So am I getting closer to the on track times for an athlete at a specific age? Yes, there are always going to be anomalies, and there's no one single path to the international star level. Some of the preliminary information that I will share on this call but provide no slides to is looking at some of the most impactful areas that athletes that have gone on to be in an international world championship final or Olympic final for Canada in the last couple of years. What are the most important factors that we want to, or that have seen in those athletes compared to every single other athlete that achieved a certain minimum level? And what we can safely share is that there is no one way to that. And half of the athletes that have ever done that for Canada, at least in the last 20 years, is simply just to be exceptional, right? Of the athletes that we had reach a world championship and Olympic final, they were able to do that as a teenager.
This is not like the sign of a good day.
Crazy.
But there's other factors, like how many events did they swim in a given year? How many competitions did they attend in a year? How many times did they race their best events in a year? And looking at what are the actual numbers. And one of the things that I think may be a key takeaway from training through a pandemic for those that were able to actively train was picking very specific times to compete and other times just to train. We have seen that a lot of our athletes that do go on to make a world championship final in their age group years, inside of 18 years old, they don't compete more than, say, at 7 long course competitions a year. I'm pulling that number. I don't have the exact number in my head. It was some decimal place, but that is something that we may observe going forward, and be able to share with more concrete information in our initial draft of these factors. So it's certainly an area that we're interested in looking at. Everything we found so far is supported by our on-track times. That in order to get to the FINA standard, in order to when you may be focusing on one event for an athlete at a specific age and a specific gender, everything we found so far is entirely supported by the on-track time development.
So as you say, there isn't one pathway to that performance, but certainly the on track system has created a pathway that addresses some set of variables. So I know that we we in Ontario use it for our team selections and camp selections, programming selections, things like that. And I think that this, like, I agree with you. I think that they provide a really great interpretation of a way to go. But yeah, to your point, there isn't just one way, right?
Yeah.
So
we've seen lots of athletes bounce around, on track, off track. Some are coming on track later in their careers. But the key point is that in order to become an Olympic finalist or a World Championship finalist, or even just to qualify for our senior teams, you know, the FINA standard is the measure to get on there, and the on-track times all lead towards that. And so it gives a really good guide, a funnel, that if you're going to be at that level, then at some point in your career, you're going to be looking towards the on-track times.
Benchmarks.
There we go.
There it is. And I echo, Kevin Anderson posted a statement in the chat, and I think I echo this, where it's a great work, Aaron. With so many variables, it makes interpreting the data difficult. Good luck. He provides you good luck. And I do too. I think I walk away from every conversation we have going, oh boy, like there's always a way to interpret the data.
Right. Yes.
And I think you do a fantastic job, and I appreciate the help you provide me in putting together the stuff I need to put together. And I hope you don't hold it against me, but I did put your email address in the chat.
Sure.
For those who might have questions, I do ask our audience to be kind. This is a very busy time for Aaron in terms of putting together some data coming out of the Olympics and Paralympics and getting some stuff into OTP. So he will get back to you. Just be patient with your questions and your timelines. Aaron, thank you very much. I really do appreciate it. I know this was a tough one to kind of schedule in, but I appreciate you taking your time.
For sure. Yeah.
And allowing me to annoy you to do it. As Lindsay has put, if you miss the PD points attendance pop up, then the jot form is in the chat. And then we are back at 4:00 with Judy Rigi for a Q&A. I've been told you can ask her anything. So come with your questions and take some time to have an insightful chat with Judy. And then for those attending the AGM later this evening, we'll see you back then. Aaron, thank you very much. Everyone,
Absolutely.
Enjoy your afternoon. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thanks all.